it's no surprise when you see corporations turn the tide in the way that they have. It's no surprise when you see the right adopting these kinds of movements. It's no surprise, in part because the original identity politics has been white identity politics. And that's what all of these social and cultural movements arose in the first instance to try to attack, right? They didn't just arise in a vacuum. So when you hear people say things like, you know, the problem is I'm not saying that you're saying this at all, but you know, you hear these screeds against social justice warriors who want things like, say that there's a victim status, oppressor. You brought that up. Mm-hmm. Say that there are oppressed and oppressors, and everything falls into these neat categories, and that's the real problem. While not giving voice to the reality that there are systems that do involve oppressors and oppressed. And I would argue that those categories are drawn to essentially and too narrowly at times, but they definitely exist. Class is a system and people without money are oppressed under it, right? Racism was a system of oppression, continues to be a system of oppression to the extent that it's de facto and not de jure, and on and on and on and on. By describing it in this way, and by even adopting the word woke to be a catch-all for things that are both real and things that are silly, superficial, and fake, and basically corporate pablum, there is a way that I think that we can participate in the delegitimizing real efforts to achieve equality, including class equality, which is, I think, the nut of what the corporate actors who embrace kind of DEI speak are trying to avoid. And I know I just said a whole lot, so I'm going to shut up for a while.
Well, you don't need to. I mean, I tend to agree with a lot of you said. You're on the left. I am a liberal. I'm not as far left as you, but I understand the critique you're making, and it's made by other leftists that I have a lot of respect for, like Adolph Reed or Susan Neiman, who differentiate between the kind of class concerns that you articulate so well and the kind of identity left that I think the key to what you're saying is that it's not that these things don't exist, but that it's they're essentialized and everything is reduced to this kind of notion that you can be a member of a group that it has group-wide kind of victim status conferred on it, regardless of the kind of texture of your individual experiences. And so you can even be, quite a powerful and prominent member of this group, but by default, you always have the kind of the totemic status.
Like Barack Obama.
Yeah, I mean, from the president on down, it's so that can be quite frustrating, and I think that some of the strongest critics of that have been critics of wokeness from the socialist left, no doubt about it. I tend to agree, and the reason why wokeness was so easily adapted by Fortune 200 corporations was because it essentially didn't ask very much. It just asked, as Adolph Reed has pointed out, and Bernie Sanders has pointed out, it just asked that the amount of board members or the amount of billionaires be consistent with their demographic representation in the country as a whole. So everything is fine if 13% of billionaires are Black or POC or whatever. And that is a very different thing than what you're talking about when you're talking about making the society more egalitarian. No doubt about it. That was easy to pick up, and it should surprise no one that it was really easy to dismantle when Mark Zuckerberg and other oligarchs sensed the slightest shift in the wind that would allow them to stop Jeff Bezos, allow them to stop performatively signaling these kind of virtues that were very lightly held at best.
So what do you do with that then? It seems to me so obvious that woke isn't a sort of tool of working class people, poor people, who are, of course, disproportionately non-white. It has been associated with Black people to the extent that if a plane goes down, they're saying it must be a woke pilot, which means a Black pilot. Constantine dubbed me DEI Barbie for disagreeing with me
Yeah, I really didn't
on my
like
views on
that at the
Israel.
time. I think
Right, like, go ahead.
yeah, I just want to say that, weaponizing the term DEI in the way it has been, I think is really ugly. And I think that it does a disservice to anybody who's trying to make serious critiques of where that kind of bureaucracy went wrong. But I have no sympathy for those types of smears, with whether it's from another commentator or whether it's from the president saying I have common sense, so if a plane goes down, I'm assuming it's DEI. I mean, I think that that's one of the nastiest things that we've seen in the recent cultural turn.
And I appreciate you saying that. What is so sort of fascinating from my perspective on the anti-woke left, LOL, on the kind of weaponization of identity critical left, is that it was always like, it's been difficult to occupy this position in part because while it is true that we had our own criticisms, it was also very, very obvious that the way that woke was being deployed and weaponized by the conservative movement, like at large, but the political movement, was as a stand-in for Blackness. Or you can say POC more broadly, but generally speaking, we're talking about Blackness. So that,
well, two different. I mean, it's that's. I don't want to cut you up, but it's
no,
also
please.
Blackness and gender and sexuality are really not the same, but they get lumped in together. I think there are some people that are critical of wokeness that are almost single-mindedly focused on gender, and there are others that are much more focused on race. But it's not always the same exact group.
I think that's fair. I'm thinking of who said this. Let's see if I can find it. That who's the like civil rights era politician who said he used to be able to say inward, and now you have to switch up your language, but it's the same thing.
The Southern strategy.
Yeah.
Lee Atwater. Isn't it?
It feels like the latest iteration of that. And it became really clear around the time that, as you alluded to in the opening of this episode, I asked Bethany Mendel when she came on Rising, simply to define woke in not a gotcha way, but simply because it can mean so many things that its slipperiness becomes its own advantage. And even within your piece, you open with some examples of woke, and you talk about the asymmetrical capitalization of the letter B in Black, but not in white, in the word white. And, I can agree that I don't have any investment in whether or not you capitalize white. I just don't. Because this is another one of those examples where it's like, to me, it's not Kim Kardashian wearing cornrows. Capitalizing the B in Black doesn't give Black people one whit of power in the United States of America.
At all.
It puts $0 in my pocket. It doesn't save me from the vagaries of our criminal justice system. It does nothing for me. But it makes somebody somewhere, usually in an academic context, feel good about themselves and feel empowered. It makes a Black academic, maybe, or a Black college kid feel like they have a little bit more power or social capital in the classroom vis-a-vis a white student. But that's not the battle that I'm trying to fight. That being said, even the fact of including that in a piece like this without sort of wrestling with ongoing, genuine inequities, importantly, class inequities that, of course, disproportionately affect Black people, does seem to me to still create a false equivalence between the option to capitalize B and not W and what's going on the other side that's motivating people to want to even like superficially cling for some kind of equality. Does that make sense?
Sure, it does. And, I get into much more detail in my book. I can make a much lengthier argument about the ways in which we have and have not transcended, historical oppressions, and what I think, the appropriate kind of responses to ongoing inequality would look like. There wasn't the space for some of that, but one of the things that, I wanted to really signal in this piece, in the limited space I had, was that there's a kind of domination through language and through wording that was a hallmark of wokeness, and that is also being adopted on the right. So, like, forcing people to say Gulf of America is not because it matters that you say Gulf of America any more than it matters saying capitalize the B, but it is an assertion of power. And that's what interests me. And I think, we could get another definition of wokeness that's essentially wokeness is the redistribution of recognition. If Marxism is the redistribution of wealth, wokeness is kind of the redistribution of cultural capital or social capital through recognition. And so forcing the B to be capitalized and also capitalizing the W would be something that I would think it's silly, because these are not ethnicities, these are color categories that that manifest in different ethnicities. You can be black or white, whether you're Cuban or, whether you're Latino, whether you're European, whatever. These are color categories. They're not the same as calling somebody Jewish. So I think it's silly to debate whether you capitalize or don't capitalize, but if you do it, it should be consistent. The reason it's not consistent is the whole point of doing it. It's the assertion of domination, even if it's only symbolic domination. And I think that's always worth paying attention to, even if it's not, and I do emphasize it's not the same thing as the president making the Associated Press either say the neologism he's just asserted, or depriving them of access to cover the White House. It's not the same thing, but these are assertions of power. And oftentimes, whenever you find a particularly unseemly or offensive or objectionable abuse of power on the right, you can go back and find a kind of a precedent or something that would raise your eyebrow if you weren't always paying attention to the culture wars that transpired from the opposite direction when they had all of the momentum in the previous decade and change.
I don't doubt that in some ways that's true. I could also say that the overreaches from the liberal era, the Obama era, the 2010s or whatever, are again responses to the previous era of white identity politics that stretched back to 1776 or 1619 or whatever number you prefer
the true founding
to use. I will say about that though, Thomas. Okay. Hannah Nicole Jones and I have had no love lost between us on Twitter over the years.
I think I recall.
Back in the before times, during the first Trump presidency, when I first started being active on the internet, she
when you
was
caught
the
fire.
queen.
Let's give you your props. When you caught fire on the internet.
Thank you for my plaudits, Thomas. But it was because I was having these debates about identity politics. And I, until that point, she was whatever she was at the time, a columnist at the New York Times. She was, one of these people who had these bona fides in the field of education. And, as a baby, consumer of media, my default was to like her. And when she started saying things that were antagonistic to Bernie and or the movement that had arisen around him, I started engaging with her completely in good faith, asking why she kept saying that you had to have a hierarchy of addressing race and class, in which racism had to be basically eliminated prior to addressing class.
Right.
Which seemed to me, quite obviously, coming from someone with enormous class privilege in the grand scheme of America, to be self-serving and frankly harmful to people who had very immediate economic concerns and couldn't wait for this magical time when nobody has any bias anymore to get their material needs met. And so we fought a great deal about that. And I wrote several pieces on the basis of the arguments that we ended up having on The Intercept and all that kind of thing. That being said, while I appreciate some of the criticisms of the 1619 Project and participated in some of them, the focus on like reimagining doing this kind of like, historical relativism project where it's like, well, what if we thought about, this other time in history as where America as we know it really took off? Doesn't seem to me to be that new. It's a thing that people do in a lot of different historical contexts. Let's rethink how we understand history, right? Let's do a thought experiment. Let's look at a different side of who Darwin really was. Did he really come up with a theory of evolution? Look at this other guy. But for the Postal Service acting a certain way, we would have thought that this other guy came up with this. I mean, we do this all the time. So I don't really understand why that particular aspect of her is so sort of triggering to folks, because you included it.
I understand. I mean,
as well.
I was working at the Times at the magazine at the time that this project happened. There's a lot of colleagues at the magazine I have a lot of love and respect for, but the way that she was able to take over that institution and force her view of this alternative history into curricula and to make it a corporate product. There was an advertisement for it during the Super Bowl. This, I thought, went beyond the kind of like intellectual thought experiment and became something more like propaganda. There was also the disturbing aspect of dismissing even Black academics, historians, fact-checking quibbles with arguments that were being made about whether, Blacks, whether Britain, was whether the Revolutionary War was caused by the idea that that slavery was going to be ended by the United Kingdom, by Great Britain. That was really something that was asserted that historians roundly rejected, and was and Nicole Jones was quite, I thought, dismissive of hewing to historical rigor. You could quibble with that and say that that's like just a detail, but it was that type of heavy-handed desire to force everybody to get on the same page that I think rubbed a lot of people the wrong way with that project. But if you want to talk about 1619 and alternative histories, in my book I get into this a bit. Like Vladimir Putin, when he invaded Ukraine, essentially wrote like a Russian 1619 project. And he wanted to reimagine Russia's founding back to like the year 800, and he got really into it. I mean, we can all just like go back further and find a different founding and kind of make the case for an alternate understanding of our history origins.
Is, right? Like,
but at some point, we're going to have to like stop like living in the past and live in the actual contemporary moment that we're fortunate enough to share. And I thought that, like, there was a kind of fetishization of history and of the wound and of the historical wound that was really strange. And I really, understood where you were coming from when you said that, these were arguments being made by one of the most influential and well-compensated writers in America of any color, a millionaire, who is just going on and on and on about slavery that happened 400 years ago, when I have never heard her express interest in the contemporary slavery that's happening right now in Ghana or anything like that.
Thomas, slavery did not end 400 years ago.
In the iPhone era, and I'll stop because I'm triggered, but in the iPhone era, we have video footage of Black Africans being sold at slave markets in Libya after the fall of Gaddafi. And I just can't take another reimagining of the nation's founding based on some millionaires' interest in slavery that used to happen.
I take the point, but three things. One, slavery, to her point, with 1619 started 400 years ago. It didn't end 400 years ago. And then you got another 100 years of Jim Crow, and that's what quibble is. Two, the idea of fetishizing history is an interesting turn of phrase, because we live in a country that does exactly that. And the mainstream historical project that most of us grew up in as elder millennials and older, at least, is one that very much fetishizes the founding fathers and tells a very limited history of who they were as men. And part of the contemporary, like postmodern historical project has been deepening and complicating our understanding of that history, a project which I think is truthful and worthwhile. And it doesn't necessarily mean you tear down every statue of George Washington that exists, But I think it's edifying and relevant not to have the reality of them being slave owners and the fundamental contradictions of the Constitution and their own life practices being a part of the historical record. And so it may be the case that Nikole Hannah-Jones has some historical inequities in her piece. And it certainly is the case that her project was kind of appropriated, weaponized, and exploited by corporations who wanted to seem like they were on the right side of history in this sort of like Obama and then Black Lives Matter era. I think all of that is true. And that goes to my point as to how corporations are going to corporation and we need to keep our eye on the ball and basically distrust the source. You should be distrusting what billionaires and multi-million-dollar corporations are doing. Nikole Hannah-Jones, as much as I was frustrated with her on an individual basis, is kind of like beside the point in all of this. She is a tool that's being used, right? But like this is part of, I think, what's been frustrating from the left and even liberal perspective as we've been engaged in this kind of woke cancel culture conversation. Because now the news story of the day is that on Wednesday, Jeff Bezos, the second, third, whatever richest man in the world, who back in 2013, 2014 bought the Washington Post, 2013 for $250 million, put out a memo, a sort of edict, directly directing the editorial content of the Washington Post, one of America's, the op-ed page of the Washington Post.
Right?
Yeah. So I'll read just a little bit of it for people who don't know. He wrote this on February 26th. I'm writing to let you know about a change coming to our opinion pages. We are going to be writing every day in support and defense of two pillars, personal liberties and free markets. We'll cover other topics too, of course, but viewpoints opposing those pillars will be left to be published by others. There was a time when a newspaper, especially one that was a local monopoly, might have seen it as a service to bring to the reader's doorstep every morning a broad-based opinion section that sought to cover all news. Today, the internet does that job. The cry of certainly the left and even some liberals was that there was a disproportionality. Even if you concede that some of the arguments about the excesses of wokeness were correct, that there was a real disproportionality issue here. Where on one side, we're talking about government actors, as you point out in your piece, I think really appropriately and well, are using their power to censor people, violate the First Amendment, threaten deportations, do actual deportations, ban books, and the like. And on the other hand, we're talking about, who gets a job in this English poetry department at Wesleyan. And now we have people like David Ritter losing their mind.
Yeah, I get the point.
David Ritter is losing his mind because he's been saying you can't trust the Washington Post for years. And liberals have been saying, oh, you're just mad that he doesn't like Bernie. It's not a big deal. Not every billionaire is bad. Why are you so upset that this guy is in charge? And if you followed the money and kept your eye on the ball and stopped getting distracted by these, pettier arguments, cornrows and the like, then we would have realized that this day was coming, that a billionaire doesn't buy a newspaper in the flailing print media industry because he's looking for a return financially on his investment. And the same goes for Elon Musk buying Twitter.
Yeah, I think not all billionaires are created equal in terms of the moral fabric. Some billionaires actually do have the public trust in mind more than others. I think that this was egregious. I think it's strange because it's not like the Post would be differentiating itself in the marketplace of ideas by hewing to those two pillars that he outlined. You look back in 1896 at what Adolph Ox said when he bought the New York Times, and that he said, he announced his objective was to give the news impartially without fear or favor, regardless of any party, sect, or interest involved, and to make the columns, the opinion pages of the New York Times, a forum for the consideration of all questions of public importance, and to that end, to invite intelligent discussion from all shades of opinion. That to me seems like what the whole entire purpose of this thing is, always has. I want to read your critique of class in the pages of the New York Times. I want to read a neoliberal defense of free markets. And I want, when, I'm watching fiery but mostly peaceful protests, to read what my congressmen and senators and government officials think the appropriate response should be. I don't think it makes my life unsafe, as Nicole Hannah-Jones and other New York Times employees tweeted in that feverish summer of 2020 when Tom Cotton's op-ed got the whole opinion page destroyed. I thought Wesley Lowery's op-ed shortly after George Floyd died, arguing that it's time to move beyond objectivity. It's time to stop pretending to be neutral and to operate now in journalism from a place of moral clarity. So in other words, for people who have the right understanding of how the world works, to lecture and to instruct readers on how to see things as opposed to inform. I'm appalled by what Jeff Bezos has done, but when I look back at the arguments that were being made with a straight face 5 years ago, 7 years ago, during the state of exception of the summer of George Floyd, or the first administration of Donald Trump, and the need to do away with allegiance to the vaunted principles that have made a century's worth of journalism matter, I don't see that some of the critics from the left have a very solid ground to stand on when they now are so upset at the kind of disrespect that one of our oligarchs has shown to, the journalistic principles that they were very willing to throw away themselves when they thought that they had the trump cards,
okay,
as it were.
So I'm gonna do the left liberal thing again, because Lowery and crew weren't exactly my ideological cohort. Now, I would say two things. I would say, one, with respect to proportionality, public discourse around the appropriateness of a column that ultimately was published in an ostensibly liberal publication is not the same thing as the owner of said publication putting out an edict that it would not be covering on its op-ed pages anything other than stories that advance the free market.
Free markets and free people.
And personal liberties?
Yeah, whatever this means.
Personal liberties. And I saw someone tweet this, and it's a very good point. What happens when those two things are in conflict? I guess we'll never know. We're going to have to look to the internet. Have
to go silent, and you just have to log on to the internet.
I mean, it's so. The other thing that this billionaire stuff is, the spotlight on billionaires is really exposed, is this system of merit can't hold up because they're just dumb as rocks. They just routinely say the dumbest things we've ever heard anybody say, and it really undermines the idea that they got there through like sheer intellect.
I 100% agree. I was just talking about this before sitting down with you about how just abysmal it is to have to sit through like Elon Musk's like freshman year at an Ivy Plus school, maybe introduction to government and politics, kind of epiphany after epiphany, the same way that Bill Ackman had his kind of introduction to foreign affairs, and it's just these people are so successful in one domain. But they're actually complete neophytes when it comes to other domains that they start to insert themselves into, and it's I can't think of, certainly not in my life has there been a kind of equivalent of this moment where you're watching Elon Musk learn about government, how it works, and what you can do, and how you negotiate between the different factions in real time as he's in charge of the government. It's just. It's and you're watching billionaires learn about free speech as they acquire the platforms with which the entire world talks to.
I think that's a little too kind even to them. I think they don't care. Hey YouTube, thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.